We're going to talk about modern culture. So we skipped from the Renaissance to modernism, and I want you to know that there were some literary and artistic periods in between, but for the sake of our class, we're kind of hitting the major ones. So modernism is the period that began roughly around 1890, which is when Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson started writing. They're the first kind of pre-modernist poets. And modernism ends, or is thought to end around 1940, around the time that World War II is coming to its peak. We define modernism in a few ways. So first we define it as the rejection of previous norms. So anything that was previously accepted in poetry, modernism is going to reject. It's going to reject the previous themes. It's going to reject the previous styles. So it's going to try to just buck the styles that were accepted and kind of do its own thing. It's going to be experimental. So modernism doesn't just apply to writing. It also applies to art and music. And so all of these different kinds of things are going to start to be really experimental. This is when you start to see a lot of abstract painting, and you'll hear improvisational jazz and things like that. So the literature is also going to become experimental. It's going to get a little bit weird. You're going to have a questioning of power structures. So you're going to start to see in poetry, poets are going to question religion. They're going to question government. They're going to question morality. They're going to question everything that people have previously accepted as being good or right. They're going to start to really examine those things. And finally, modernism is characterized by a kind of tone of skepticism or disillusionment. So modernists have kind of seen the worst of humanity, and that colors how they view the world. So there aren't going to be a whole lot of sunshiny, happy, optimistic poems in here like we saw in the Renaissance. There's no pastoral poetry in modernism because people now are kind of living in these grimy industrial cities, so they have a really different outlook. Modernism was really brought about by the second industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution had to do with like steam power and that kind of thing, transportation. But the second industrial revolution is more fine. So we have in this period electricity and combustion engines, assembly lines, mass production. So all of these things start to really get sort of high energy, high production, as opposed to the work of the individual. So instead of like an artisan who spends his whole life perfecting the making of a chair, you're now going to have a machine that can make a chair. Things like that. Now, radio and photography are also changing the nature of visual art. So it's no longer necessary for painters to make an exact portrait of somebody because a camera can do that. So now painters get to experiment. Their job is no longer just to document things. It's now to kind of create their impressions of things and kind of insert their own style into it. And finally, the second industrial revolution leads us to build technologies that even we don't understand. And this especially relates to weaponry. So we've now created these automatic weapons. We've created chemical weapons. We're close to creating the atomic bomb. And these are things that will change the course of human history. So it's one of those situations where just because we can maybe didn't mean we should, but we did anyway. So that industrial revolution and that advanced weaponry leads to the crisis that is World War I. And a lot of times when we think about the world wars, we automatically just kind of think of World War II because there's more movies about it and more songs about it and more books about it. But World War I is really the more deadly, terrible war. And maybe the reason that it's not documented so much is because it doesn't have like a clean, clear hero and villain. World War I was really murky. So World War I was fought in the early 1900s, and it combined 20th century weaponry, so this new advanced weaponry, with 19th century tactics. So in the 19th century, meaning the 1800s, when people went to war, they would sort of just charge at each other on horseback with swords and just meet on the battlefield and go at it. But you can imagine what happens when men who are armed with automatic rifles and chemical gases and things like that just meet on the battlefield. It's a huge loss of life. So you have face-to-face combat with machine guns, cannons, mortars, tanks, etc. For every yard gained in these fights, an average of 100 men died. So if you can picture what that must have looked like, every time an army would advance 1 yard, 100 men died to do it. Almost 17 million people died in combat during World War I, and another 10 million died from illness and starvation. So at that time, that was 3% of the world's population. So no matter who you were, anywhere in the world, you knew a lot of people who died in World War I. So you can imagine how this shook people. They didn't know that that many people could die at once. Nothing like this had happened since the Black Plague. The Battle of Verdun was one of the most famous and deadly battles of World War I. It was fought in France. 700,000 men died or were injured in this battle, and it was the longest and deadliest battle in human history to date. So still, we have never had a battle that was as deadly as the Battle of Verdun. And still, if you go to Verdun in France, there are places where the grass doesn't grow because so many men died there. It was a terrible tragedy. And again, ultimately kind of for nothing. World War I didn't really achieve anything. It just kind of led to World War II. People who fought or lived during this period, during World War I, were often referred to as the Lost Generation. They were called the Lost Generation because they were really so damaged by the war that in many cases they withdrew from society, or they maybe decided not to have children because the war was just too terrible and they couldn't fathom bringing children into the world. They were often depressed. This is when shell shock or PTSD will be identified. They call it shell shock. They won't call it PTSD for still many decades, but people are starting to understand that the war kind of ruins people. Generally, we've been talking about the modern period generally, but its specific effect on poetry was really interesting. So because the world is no longer orderly, modern poets remove order from their poems. So what you've seen up to this point in poetry is very orderly. So everything rhymes and has rhythm and meter. But in this period, in the modern period, Ezra Pound, who's one of the most famous poets from the modern period, he kind of wrote the rule book, and he insisted on what he called verse libre, which is French for free verse. So he rejects the idea that poems should rhyme or have rhythm. The poetry of this era reflects deep depression, mistrust of government, and rejection of God. Why rejection of God? Well, again, imagine that you've lived in a world that you thought was a good and just place, and then a third of the world's population dies in a terrible, meaningless war. That will lead you to question, is God real? Is he up there? Why would he let this happen? So most of these poets kind of reject the idea of God and heaven and forgiveness and salvation. The modern period is going to forsake or ignore the Renaissance's elevation of nature and search for ideal beauty. So if you remember during the Renaissance poetry, we were reading a lot of poems where like a lover would be compared to natural things, or a woman would be described as, the most beautiful. If you think about Christopher Marlowe's passage about Helen of Troy and how she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Instead, modernism is going to try to tell it like it is. So it's going to be more drastic, gritty realism. It's going to accept the ugliness of the world instead of trying to kind of gloss over it with flowery language. And it has a desire to reflect the chaos of society and the chaos of the poem. So as we get deeper and deeper into modernism, you're going to see the poems get more and more unusual, both in their content and in their form, like how they're written. Ezra Pound, Amy Lowell, and E.E. Cummings were, again, three of the most famous poets during this period, and they developed a philosophy called Imagism. And so they published this manifesto called the Imagist Manifesto in 1915 that laid out the rules for modern poets. So these are the rules. Number one, they want to use the language of common speech, but to employ the exact word, not nearly exact, nor the merely decorative word. So you're not going to have long, flowery lines that have a bunch of complicated sentences. These poets want to write the way people speak. They want it to reflect reality, and they want it to be exact. So they're going to be succinct poems. They're not going to be long and sprawling. Number two, they believe that the individuality of a poet may often be better expressed in free verse than in conventional forms. So again, these poets want to tell things like they are. They don't want to put anything artificial in their poem, and they see form or rhyming poetry as artificial. It's like a kind of a limitation that they're putting on their own creativity. So they reject that. Number three, they want absolute freedom in the choice of subject. So again, if you look back at the Renaissance, all the poems we read were either about love or religion, really. These poets are going to reject that. They're going to write poems about death, destruction, sickness, sex, whatever they want. Nothing is really off limits anymore. Number four is kind of a weird one. It says, to present an image, we are not a school of painters, but we believe that poetry should render particulars exactly and not deal in vague generalities, no matter how magnificent or sonorous. So what they mean by this is they want to use real images instead of kind of broad symbolic language. So instead of saying, love is like a rose in the garden, they want to tell you literally what love is like, and they want to use the exact words for it, even if they're not magnificent or sonorous. So even if they don't sound beautiful, beauty kind of doesn't matter anymore. It's all about reality and making things as real as possible, even if they're not pleasant to hear or to read. And last one, it says to produce a poetry that is hard and clear, never blurred or indefinite. So again, there's not going to be a whole lot of like symbolism and reference. This is going to be very like clear, difficult to kind of swallow poetry. Other things that happen during the modern period, we have a questioning of power structure, which finally leads to questioning of race and gender construct. So if you notice, up until this point, we haven't had any female poets, and we haven't had any poets who weren't white. So because during the modern period, we're starting to question how the government, how society, how religion impacts us, we're also starting to question, why are men always in charge, or why are white people always in charge? And so that's going to lead to women starting to enter the accepted canon, which means that the women are starting to enter like the important literature and music and things like that. So we're going to start to see women poets who are taken as seriously as male poets. The Harlem Renaissance will take place kind of later in the modern period. And of course, as you know, the Harlem Renaissance was a time where black poets and black novelists and writers and musicians were really elevated and taken very seriously. Many poets are going to start to experiment with Eastern verse forms. So because transportation is, because of the Industrial Revolution, transportation is now more accessible. So people have seen the whole world now. So poets are starting to bring in like Japanese influence. They're writing haiku and tanka and all these other Eastern forms. And finally, jazz and blues are developed, and these styles of music are both kind of chaotic and sad, which was a direct response to what was going in the world during the modern period. So that's our modern introduction. Keep these ideas in mind as you start to read the modern poetry and see if you can kind of connect these ideas to the content of what you're reading. Good luck.